All right, I am joined once again by Josh Waldoch, contributor for Reviewing the Brew, as well as host of his own podcast, the Bernie's Beer District. He co-hosts that alongside Tyler, where they cover the Brewers. Josh, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. I mean, obviously, as we're recording right now, I'm not sure when this is going to come out, but we're about 20 hours into the lockout and things are still somewhat normal. So
I just want baseball again. Is that too much to ask for Rob Manfred?
apparently,
Yeah, it is what it is. We are back for another edition of the more disappointing Brewers at each position. We have done the infield. You can check that out on our YouTube channel, as well as the best of. If you haven't subscribed, please go ahead and subscribe. If you're new to the channel and it's your first time watching, welcome to the channel. I do appreciate you coming on. Again, click that subscribe button and press the like. It does allow others to see the content that we're putting out. We did just have a video come out last night in reference to the Jackie Bradley Jr. trade, and I'm sure we'll touch on Jackie Bradley Jr. in a little bit here. So we're kind of lumping all the outfield into one group, and we're going to discuss the top 3 most disappointing outfielders. So we'll go ahead and jump right into that. I'm excited. If you have any other names you would like to add to this list, go ahead and leave that in the comment section. I do appreciate that. All right, we'll jump right in. Josh, who was your number 3 most disappointing outfielder?
number 3, I'm going with the father of one of the brightest young stars in baseball, going with Dante Bechet. He played 2 seasons with the Brewers, spanning 91 and 92, where he was the Brewers' primary right fielder. I'll be honest, he wasn't particularly bad. He was, I'd say, and the numbers would actually back up, kind of the definition of replacement level when looking at an aggregate of his time. He came over from a trade with the Angels, who were at that point the California Angels, would soon become the Anaheim, and then their name is weird.
They change their name every 5 to 10 years. It's just
well, what are you gonna do? But traded from the Angels in exchange for Dave Parker back in the 90 to 91 offseason. He spent 2 seasons with the Brewers. Aggregate his time in Milwaukee, ended up with a 261 average, 293 on base, 399 slugging, which the slugging actually is, fairly respectable. Obviously, we're not in the full-on in the steroid era yet at this point. We're kind of teetering in to it, but not awful. I mean, ended up with a total of 20 home runs in his time in Milwaukee. Had a much better second season where he hit 287, 318 on base, 406 slugging, and actually had an OPS plus of 104. So OPS plus measures OPS and aggregates or averages it out. So 100 is league average. So he was above league average for his final season in Milwaukee. He was OPS plus of 84, which is 16% below league average. But it ended up, so he had an OPS plus of about 90 in his total time in Milwaukee, which not awful, not great. Kind of the definition of replacement level. And when looking at Fangraphs WAR in his 2 seasons in Milwaukee, recorded 0.1 F WAR, literally replacement level player. Was kind of a late bloomer. Ended up rattling off 3 straight All-Star appearances. Of course, was one of the best players in 94 and 95, where his homer really popped in Colorado, which was just a hell of a hitter's park back then. And then kind of went on to have a respectable portion of the career. I mean, Cincinnati and Boston wrapping up there. But yeah, he's on my list just because he wasn't able to get it going in his time in Milwaukee. Was traded for Dave Parker, who solid player, kind of at the very tail end of his career when he was with the Brewers, but was an all-star with his time in Milwaukee. But yeah, I'm going with Dante Bechet just as a result of not fully reaching the potential that he had in Milwaukee and kind of just being a replacement level player before being traded away and I guess blossoming there in Colorado.
I think one of the most, I think when you think of his name and someone hears the name Dante Bechet and we say disappointing, I think at first glance people say, really, he had a really, really good career. But when you look at his career when he was in Milwaukee, before he really became the player that he was, you can say, wow, yeah, it was very disappointing, because as soon as he left Milwaukee, he was an MVP finalist 4 out of the next 5 years. Or 4 out of the next 6 years, he was an MVP finalist. He was a all-star for 4 of those 6 years. He was a Silver Slugger, and he just really kind of blossomed into the player that we were kind of hoping he would be when he was in Milwaukee. But yeah, you just look at his numbers. His first season, batted .238, only had 15 home runs, 59 RBIs. The next season, only had 5 home runs. He cut down the home runs quite significantly, but his batting average went up. And then he also had more RBIs. He had more doubles the second year, but overall, just looking at what he did while he was in Milwaukee, very disappointing. And he ended up having a really good career, 14 seasons. Again, 4-time All-Star, 4-time MVP finalist. Not finalist, but MVP votes. He was a very good player. Just in Milwaukee, he is quite disappointing.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously kind of a late bloomer. I mean, he was 24 when he made his major league debut, didn't get consistent playing time until he was 26, and kind of hit his stride when in his early 30s, and that carried up, I mean, well into his mid to even late 30s. I mean, he was putting up solid numbers when he was 37 in Boston. Just a guy who, I don't know if County Stadium wasn't the best place for him, but something clicked when he got to Colorado in that high altitude, and the balls fly out there.
Yeah, for sure. And at the time, that was an expansion team too. That was the Rockies were just becoming a brand new baseball team. Yeah, so great. Who is your number 2 disappointing outfielder in Brewers history?
So I'm going with another, I'd say fairly well-known player, Marquise Grisham. Grissom was originally drafted by the Expos, was all-star a couple times there, then Atlanta and Cleveland, before settling into Milwaukee for 3 seasons from 98 to 2000. And again, I mean, he's kind of a guy who you think about and it's like, oh, well, he had a solid career. And just kind of looking straight at raw numbers, I mean, it wasn't bad by any means. I mean, a career 272 average with 318 on base, 415 slugging. I mean, all respectable, especially for a guy who was primarily a center fielder. But in his time in Milwaukee, he's a guy who I remember my dad talked about as someone who was just always had a nagging injury, just kind of always a guy who was playing through stuff. And I mean, I don't know, that's just kind of what I grew up hearing and looking at the numbers. I mean, he was respectable in Milwaukee. I mean, the 260 batting average, 304 on base with the 383 slugging, which not bad for a center fielder. Ended up having 44 homers in about 1,900 plate appearances. Ended up with a 73 WRC plus. So about 25% below league average production for that time, give or take, which again, I mean, with a strong defensive value, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but he wasn't a particular standout in defense. I mean, he wasn't awful, but he was, I'd say, serviceable. I ended up his time in Milwaukee, his 3 seasons, with a -8 F WAR. I mean, -0.8 F WAR, so 0.8. But actually, one of the reasons I have him on is he went on to have several solid seasons after. I mean, he, age 35 and 6th season was above league average offensive production. That was with the Dodgers and the Giants. So kind of a guy who had a lull in his career in the early 30s and then picked it back up after he left the Brewers. And that's why I'm including him on my list.
For sure. And you look at what he did prior to going to Milwaukee, kind of the opposite of who we just talked about in Dante Bechet, because Dante kind of blossomed after he left Milwaukee. It just didn't happen. And he didn't have a bad season or bad 2 years with the Brewers, but it was just nothing compared to the expectations that we were getting when he was coming to the Brewers. You talk about his injuries. He did play a significant amount of games with the Brewers in both seasons, just never really lived up to the expectations that we had coming in from the Expos, as well as the Braves before he came over to the Brewers. And then, like you said, afterwards, he had a couple of really good years, not great years, but a lot better than he did with the Brewers. For whatever reason it just didn't work out for him in Milwaukee. He did put up some numbers, but it was still a disappointment. Just looking at what we expected to get versus what we actually got from him.
So I just found an article from 2000 talking about when he was benched in August for the Brewers. I mean, just kind of a very low on base percentage, especially because he was the Brewers' primary leadoff hitter in that time.
Mm-hmm.
Just, something happened in those 3 years where he just wasn't able to get in the groove. So that's why he's on the list.
For sure. All right. Who is the number one most disappointing outfielder?
So at this time, the most recently former Brewer, I think that makes sense. I think I constructed that grammatically enough. I'm going with Jackie Bradley Jr. This isn't even a situation where it's like recency bias, like, oh no, he was, where we'll look back in 5 years and say, oh, his time in Milwaukee wasn't that bad. From an offensive standpoint, it was. I'd say he was a big free agent pickup for the Brewers back in February. Would you agree?
Oh, for sure. I feel, yeah, for sure. When that trade came out, I made a video about that way back then, and I'm thinking, all right, this is going to be that final piece that the Brewers need. Great defense, decent offensively, can put up some numbers. Had a really big postseason for the Red Sox. Just won a World Series not long ago before he was traded to or signed by the Brewers. So we're thinking, okay, this is going to be a piece. But yeah, we were all very, very sadly disappointed with what we got from him.
Obviously he's a good player. I mean, he has very successful in his time in Boston. I mean, was an all-star, won a Gold Glove. You mentioned before, kind of had the postseason heroics that we were kind of like, oh yeah, this is our guy. I mean,
yep.
I wrote a piece talking about how like he was going to kind of work in a tandem with Bobby Garcia, Lorenzo Cain, and those guys are all going to get about 120 or so games, but we'll be spotting each other and kind of creating a 3-man rotation, and that just did not work. I mean, he had one of the worst seasons ever for someone who he didn't qualify for the batting title. So if you look at it from minimum of 400 plate appearances, among one of the worst. I mean, a 34 OPS plus. So looking from an OPS standpoint, 64%, I mean, almost 2/3 below league average. When looking at it from a WRC plus, 35 WRC plus. So again, very low from the offensive production. Did have 6 homers. I mean, almost 31% strikeout percentage. I mean, he was, for some reason, baseball players are habitual, are guys who are very habitual. Maybe him signing late in the offseason, he just never was able to kind of fully find his groove. But from an offensive standpoint, it was not pretty. Ended up in his time in Milwaukee with a negative 0.8 F-WAR, so same as Marquise Grisham, or in about a third, actually about more like a quarter of the games he played. And, obviously defensively he was good. I mean, he was a Gold Glove finalist in center field. But just a guy who offensively was never able to get it going with the Brewers. And especially when you were a player like Bradley Jr., who kind of profiled as a defensive first, but a guy who had respectable offense, but his defense was his main bread and butter. When you're unable to produce really anything in a offensive get anything going offensively, it's tough to justify keeping him around, and that's ultimately the Brewers traded him for Hunter Renfroe. I know you had a video on that last night. You recorded as it broke. But yeah, back in Boston, hopefully he'll find his groove again.
And then when you're paying him that much money, like I said, like the Brewers don't give big contracts. And it was just one of those contracts where you're like, wow, how are we going to get out of it? And then 30-40 minutes before the lockout begins, the Brewers front office does their voodoo magic, and next thing you know, he's gone. And the Brewers get Hunter Renfroe, who's a very good defender, has a cannon for an arm, and he hits a ton of home runs, and he's an RBI guy. So I know we had to give up 2 really good prospects, but you sometimes you see this in NBA, right? Like salary dump, like we'll give you our former all-star, but we'll trade in our first-round pick with him, and then you take this guy from us. You don't see it a ton in baseball. I wish more teams did it. but you don't see that often. So when the Brewers were able to do that at the last minute, man, that's incredible.
Yeah, I mean, it just offensively just didn't click. I mean, I pulled up the exact he had the 8th lowest OPS plus of any batter with a minimum of 400 plate appearances dating back to 1871. I mean, so that's, we're talking guys who played in the 1880s. And it, was in the first percentile for expected weighted on base average, which basically takes what does to batting average what slugging does, if that makes sense. It factors in, the hitting result. It factors in run production into slugging. I mean, into the batting average. It's just kind of give you a quick flyover of it. It's actually a very useful stat. First percentile for expected slugging. So just a guy, 6th percentile for strikeout percentage. It didn't click offensively for him. And I think it's difficult to include anyone else on the list above him, which is unfortunate because he seems like a great guy, very active in the community.
Yeah.
And just a great guy in general, but something about Milwaukee didn't click with him. If it was, there's so many things that could have happened. It could have just been a habitual thing or whatever.
Well, credit to him throughout the whole season. Although he struggled, he never really came off as like disgruntled or had a bad attitude. Like he was involved in the community. He was from what I can tell, like everyone liked him. His teammates. He didn't really not get along with anybody. So it's just, and he didn't just have a bad season. He had one of the worst statistical seasons of anybody, especially in the outfield and especially in Brewers history, like baseball history. Bad. Yeah. So
maybe the friendly confines of Fenway will help him find his groove because I
think he's gonna bounce back. I really, really do, because in Boston, where he has that familiarity and they have a good team, I think he will fit right in. He's comfortable there. His family grew up, his kids grew up there. I think he'll be okay. But I'm glad he's gone. Like I like the guy, but I'm so glad he's gone.